Hello, everybody. This week we're joined by Radhika Trivedi. We talk about educational policy, differences in education between India and the UK, and we discuss the curriculum review of the Durham Society for Economic Pluralism. Next to that, we also discuss the caste system of India and its effects on politics and language. We're glad to have you and hope you enjoy this week's episode. Hey Radhika, it's so great to have you. How have you been?
Pretty good considering the circumstances. How about you?
Good. So, what have you been up to?
Well, things have gotten into full swing during term time here. So currently, I'm just working on my dissertation research, a lot of master's applications, research projects, and Mario Kart, just to remind myself that there's still good things in life.
So, what is your dissertation about?
So, as of now, I'm analyzing how diversity and protests affects public opinion and shapes public policy. I'm looking at models of intersectionality and coalitional politics over identity politics, which is, I think, something that's quite relevant to the current state of politics in most places right now.
So, what is identity politics?
Identity politics basically speaks to how identity and characteristics of identity, like say your race, gender, where you come from, your economic background, things like that, sort of play into your political activism in one sense. So when you conduct your politics solely based on these factors rather than like policy beliefs, that's when you sort of become segregated into that category of identity politics. Whereas
Mhm.
regular politics or politics traditionally as we know it has more to do with theories of how governance should be conducted based on certain ideals and values and things like that. So it sort of takes away from like those values, departs from that, and goes into more of an individualistic or even like a group sort of think, which I think is understandable on some level, but at the same time, it can be quite harmful if it's not a nuanced application.
Okay. So, how did you get into this topic?
Um, well, I think like most of us, have been quite disillusioned by the state of politics in general in most countries over the past, say, even 2 or 3 years, maybe. And I feel like there's just increased polarization in almost every country now based on like identity alliance, and it's a lot of like us versus them narratives, and like there's just no sense of understanding or no exercise of sort of listening to other perspectives with an open mind, which I think is really important if there has to be any sort of moral or political progress in any place. So I don't really see these things happening, at least from a personal point of view. And that's why I've sort of become invested in whether or not this is actually the best way to go about shaping the political narratives of our time. And protest, because I think in places like democracies, protest is probably the most effective sort of weapon we have in our arsenal as a populace. The way to get your voice heard, or if you have any demands, or to demand accountability even from your government, the best way to do it apart from having an election is to protest. And I think that has become quite visible in the past few months, at least in places like America and the UK, even in India, since last year, after the passing of a couple of controversial acts and things like that. There was a lot of protests, and it's just been a feature of democracies as we know it for a while. So I think it's interesting to see how people use this one very powerful tool to sort of shape their political narratives based on identity politics or like their political values and things like that.
So, where do you think like the polarization came from? Why did it get worse?
Um, I feel like what we experience now is sort of the culmination of a lot of big changes that have happened in the past 2 or 3 decades, especially after liberalization during the 80s and 90s. So I think we see a lot of spillover effects from countries that were previously colonial strongholds and then liberalized, and the changes that have happened in their government and in the way that big corporations have come in to play a part in their economies and their society. It sort of started off, and now it's coming to a sort of hilt. And that, along with the whole a lot of like wars and things like that that happened during the 90s and the early 2000s, um, that has sort of caused all of these problems that are interlaced. So, say if we look at the refugee crisis, a lot of it came out of the wars that were fought during the 90s and the early 2000s, and now we're starting to see the effects of it in places like Western Europe, or even in places like America. We're seeing in India the culmination of wars that were fought in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, with the Rohingya crisis in Myanmar, and even with Kashmir, which has been an issue since, I don't know, the 50s. So these are all things that sort of started a very long time ago, but I feel like now they've developed and we're seeing the effects of them play out. And because of these very sudden changes happening, people are finding it difficult to make their systems evolve at the same pace. So we're not ready as a society to face all of these problems yet with our current institutions, and that's why there's a sort of backlash happening. Because I think as human beings, the first thing you do when you encounter something unfamiliar is to sort of close up. And I think we see that in a lot of countries, even in the trade policy or the immigration policy or whatever it is. The second you see something that looks unfamiliar, you tend to want to, retreat into your own shell. And that's where I think all of these us versus them narratives, like the very intense nationalism and polarization and not wanting to, you know, sort of accept as valid someone else's point of view that's different from yours comes from.
So, but you say this comes from like the institutions we have. Is that because our institutions aren't equipped for this, or is there a different way to go about these topics like migration?
I definitely think there's an element of that. I feel that um, the way that a lot of things are changing in our societies, like our political values, like uh, the rate of change of technology and the part it plays, things like big tech and big corporations, and how those are sort of impacting every aspect of life. These are things that our institutions, as like governments or banks or things that are just not equipped to understand yet. Even if we look at, say, big tech and the part it plays in places like Western Europe or America, or even India for that matter, um, there's people who are getting access to things at a level that they could never have imagined before. Say, like a couple of years ago, Reliance Networks in India, they introduced this mobile network called Geo, which is supposed to be the cheapest mobile network in the entire world, right? And this improved access to the internet and cellular services and things like that to like remote villages where they don't even have 24/7 electricity yet, they don't have education yet. So you can understand that this has like impacts that as a government they're not yet ready to understand, because it all happens so very quickly. So without understanding how these big changes are going to affect society, there's no way that people can be equipped to deal with the problems, because the paces are just so very different. So I think this is one sense where things sort of get complicated in the way our systems are not, dealing with things well.
So, you mean that these technologies came to some villages first before they had like schools and everything set up? How does that work? How does that even happen?
So say right now still about 80% of India's workforce is still employed in the informal sector, which is things like agriculture, just like manual labor and things like that. So these people, they, and obviously around I think 25% of children who should be enrolled in school or at like the age where they can be enrolled in school in India are still not enrolled. There's a massive problem of access and education. um, so when you don't have these like basic facilities and stuff, and then you're handed like technology that you can't even begin to understand the implications of, because you're not equipped with the agency. So what is the actual point of education? Is to sort of make you understand how to use all of these different tools to benefit yourself or other people in some way, right? But if you are at point A where you don't have all of these basic resources, and then you're given like point D, it's very difficult to make that jump. And I think that's where a lot of problems come about.
Wow. Yeah. That is so interesting though. I hadn't even thought that that would be how it could go. That something like that technology would get there before they would have access to schools. But is that where does that problem come from in India? Is that yeah.
I mean, it can be a good thing and a bad thing. Obviously, it's good that people are getting such cheap and easy access to a resource, which I think is very, very important in today's world, especially in like the time of COVID. Everything's digitized. I know even people living in villages near that they when they go to tutorials they are now doing things online. So it is a good thing, but at the same time, um, the question of having using something responsibly and having enough sort of agency to understand how to use something that's given to you is something that needs to be taught before you just hand something in someone's lap. So, um, say like there was a reason why TikTok was banned in India even before the entire conspiracy about the Chinese taking the data from TikTok happened. And I think one of the largest debates people were having is because there were a lot of people who were um, they had less access to education and things like that, so they didn't understand the implication of the content they put on TikTok. And there was a lot of problem with children putting up content on TikTok and how that was sort of used by people in less than savory ways, to put it very formally. So these are things that I feel like that sort of understanding of responsibility that comes with all these tools is something that needs to be first done before putting data out and technology out like that.
Wow. So TikTok actually got banned in India.
Yeah, TikTok got banned I think about 4 months ago, if I'm not wrong. But that was more because of privacy concerns.
Yeah, I understand that. So let's switch it a little bit. So you're studying because you're from India, but you're studying in the UK, right? So how did you decide to go and study in the UK?
Well, long story short, they don't offer my course anywhere else in the world, at least to my knowledge. So I study philosophy, politics, and economics. And I chose that because I'm really interested in how, sort of different disciplines come together, because I feel like society as a whole, it's not as neatly categorized as we tend to see it when we study these disciplines. And I feel like, at least with my degree, they try to bridge the gaps between those like one track ways of thinking to see the interconnections, and it just paints a more realistic picture of our society, which is why I enjoy learning about it. um, I also really enjoy the way that they teach in the UK, because it's quite critical, it's quite independent. You're made to do a lot of your own reading and research, sort of made to think about the bigger questions and the reasons why you're studying the things you're studying and what impact it has on the field, but on society in general. And I also enjoy the critical discussion aspect of it, which is something that I don't find a lot of back home, at least. So I enjoy listening to other people's ideas about things, and I feel like the best ideas are the ones that are collaborative. So
With that,
I think, like Hegel's idea of the dialectic, you have an idea, and then the natural response is to sort of think about why or why not it may be correct, right? And I think the best way to do that is to go tell someone else and see what they think about it from a fresh perspective. So I think the best way to even learn something is to teach it to someone else, because then you start to see the gaps in your own understanding, or reflect on what the idea actually has been absorbed in your own mind as well when you're actually talking about it to someone else. So I think it's very important for learning to be collaborative and with other people, discussion based, applied to the things that in the real world that you experience every day. And only then can you sort of start to relate yourself to that theory, or even understand where it's flawed or where it doesn't apply and how it can be improved. I don't think these things can be done in isolation, or from a textbook, or just by doing assessments and exercises and things like that.
so how is education in the UK different from education in India?
Um, I mean, I can obviously only offer my personal experience, and I went to university in India for about 6 or 7 months before coming to the UK. I was doing just economics, and the biggest difference I found is again the fact that back home, at least at the undergraduate level, there always seems to be a right answer that's given to you, and I found that very different over here because the first thing that you're told when you come here is that there are no right answers, and everyone's opinion, everyone's opinion, as long as it's logical and well reasoned out, is valid enough to at least be listened to and engaged with, if not, accepted. So I think that's one of the biggest differences. Another one is obviously the way they teach. So back home, um, college, at least right after school, is sort of like school because we have like lectures throughout the day where professors come in and teach us things, and we have assessments that are based on the content you learn, and there's not much space for this sort of critical discussion and your own research and independent work, which is the part that I enjoy. So I mean, there are some universities, obviously, even in India, like liberal arts colleges, where it's now becoming more popular. But I think as a norm in most places, that's not the case. So,
Okay. So, and then also moving from India to the UK, was that an easy adjustment or was there a big change?
um, I wouldn't say it was difficult, but it was definitely different. I don't think you can appreciate, yeah, I don't think you can really appreciate the difference until you yourself have experienced it. It feels like at least I was brought up on quite a lot of, you know, English pop culture and things like that. So you watch all these movies, read all these books, and you feel like you know what it's going to be like to, live in the country. And then the second you land, it's just completely different. So it's nothing like you could have ever imagined it. So it was quite different. But I quite enjoy it because I found a very open and friendly community here, and everyone's very passionate about what they do. So I've had some very interesting conversations in the past 2.5 years, which I think was my favorite part of the entire thing. And it's always fun to sort of experience another culture and just immerse yourself completely in it. It sort of makes you realize how different things can be, and I don't think any amount of reading, like theory about development economics or anything, really can prepare you for the differences.
Okay. So, what were some things that you learned over the years or so far that you're like, this is some really interesting knowledge that I would share?
In terms of economics, or just in
Sure.
general.
Or in general with economics.
um, Personally, I think the biggest thing that comes to mind is maybe um, this little thought experiment by John Rawls. It sort of shaped the way that I look at things, and this is something that I did in my first year at university here in, I think, politics or philosophy, maybe one of them. Um, he basically conducted this thought experiment called the Veil of Ignorance, which is essentially you don't know what your place is like in society. So we imagine that we have no idea what gender we are, what race we are, like caste, creed, color, economic background, disabilities. We don't know any of that. So you're behind this hypothetical veil of ignorance. And then based on that, you have to decide what kind of principles you want in your society that will run your society, essentially. Right. So without knowing what your place is going to be in this society, the rational conclusion is that you would want, a just society with fair institutions, equal institutions, things like that. So the conclusion of this entire thought experiment is the fact that there's no morally persuasive reason why some people are born privileged and other people are not. There's no morally good enough reason why some people should suffer and why some people are born, just coasting along in life. So that's not a good or bad thing, but it's just something to keep in mind when you sort of conduct your own personal and public affairs in life, right? So this is something that has really impacted the way I approach all of my studies and just life in general. I always like to approach things with um, at least some sense of empathy and compassion. because there's no reason why I'm in this position that makes me better off or worse off than someone else. So that's definitely an academic learning that, I have applied in a lot of spheres of life.
Nice. That is a good lesson. So would that change your view on current institutions as well?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Say, for example, right now, even with the presidential debate, there's been a lot of talk about how it's fraud and things like that. And to be honest, I don't know. There may be, but I think beyond the entire like polarized debate of whether Trump is lying, whether Biden is lying, or whether he's committed fraud, the entire you know idea is about how there should be free and fair elections. The electoral process needs to be transparent and accountable, and that is, I feel like, the bedrock value that people are actually fighting for when they talk about these things. So even in that sense, that is the idea of a just institution. And then if that's the result that comes out of a just institution, it is somehow acceptable to people regardless of whether or not it's a result that they would want themselves. So I mean, yeah, definitely. I think it's still very influential today in almost everything we do.
Okay. So in your studies, you combine politics, philosophy, economics, the three of them,
Yeah.
or yeah, right? So which one is more what you want to get into?
So, well, I mean, I'm doing a lot of politics right now. My dissertation is on politics. But I sort of want to get into public policy and specifically education policy. So, I mean, I'm not entirely sure where that intersection lies. It's still, I feel like, a mix of the three. But yeah, probably a little more economics than, say, politics or philosophy.
Okay. So what is educational policy?
So education policy is basically the sort of principles and values that shape the legislation that governments enforce for educational sectors. So things like, at what age should people go to school? What should the curriculum be like? What kind of system should there be in terms of, primary school, secondary school, high school? What should the admissions process be? Should it be a private system or a public system? That sort of thing. All of that would fall within the purview of education policy.
Okay. And is that educational policy on the UK or worldwide?
So I'm mainly interested in lower income areas or developing countries and their educational systems because I feel like there is a lot of work to be done in that aspect. And obviously, coming from somewhere like that, I, sort of see the impact it would have for a policy to be good or terrible. I've seen firsthand what it looks like when the state does not do enough for children. And I feel like because education is such an integral part in how we understand ourselves and the world around us, it's something that really everyone should have a good shot at. So, definitely, probably, yeah, in developing countries. What I'm mainly interested in is how education can be used as a tool for social mobility in vulnerable communities, like people from lower income backgrounds or historically discriminated minorities and things like that. Because I feel like obviously those are the places where it makes the most difference.
What do you mean social mobility?
Social mobility in terms of if you're from a lower income background, having a good education, having a degree, having those skills that come from a good education, those are things that can help you sort of increase your income, increase your life prospects and your just standard of living in general. So that is social mobility in one sense, mobility from, say, lower income brackets to upper income brackets, to put it very crudely, but I think more in terms of, how much welfare you can actually achieve.
Okay, and that is within a country, like for a single person, whether they can climb up the social ladder or.
Yeah, so to speak.
Okay. And so a little bit related to that, but how does that work in India? Because I don't know that much about that, all honesty. So how does that work in India? Because you have the caste system, I think.
Yeah.
So how does that work?
Um, well, the caste system, so it's a system of very rigid social stratification into ranked groups in Hinduism as a religion mainly. And so it originated in the Vedic era, which was around 1500 to 500 BC, so like a really long time ago. um, and caste is not actually a word of Indian origin, so it's usually described as varna and jati, where varna means category or class, and jati is used to refer to the subcategories within that varna. So um, this was basically a system that sort of looked at an idealized human calling, so to speak, and this was understood in terms of professions. So there can be a lot of sort of parallels drawn between the caste system and things that happened in places like, the Roman Empire, say, because again, there was the Brahmins, the highest caste, which can be compared to the clergy. There was the royalty, which can be compared to the Kshatriyas. There was Vaishyas, or the merchants and trading class. So these three were things that were there in like European societies and things like that as well. The only difference is probably the lowest class, which is the Shudra, and those are the labor classes, and you know um, so these differences in status, they're traditionally justified by the religious doctrine of karma, which is something people probably heard of in Buddhist philosophy and even Hindu philosophy. And it's basically a belief that someone's place in life is determined by their deeds in a previous life. So your karma or your deeds in your previous life determine what caste you will be born into, which means that caste is not something that is selected, it is predestined, and it's descent based or hereditary. So you can't change your caste, you're just born into it. And obviously, this is a system that's perpetuated for a very, very long time now. And I think it sort of got solidified in India's social fabric during the Mughal era and the British colonial period. So that would be between like the 1600s to like 1947 when we got independence. So that's like Mughal, post Mughal period, and then the English. And during this time, what happened is that a lot of caste categories got codified into law and administration. So earlier, even though there were societal rules that sort of were shaped around caste, it wasn't ingrained or integrated into our systems or administration as such. And that's what happened when the British came here to India. Um, so I'll give you one example. There was something called, I think, the Crime Act, the Crime Category Criminal, sorry, the Criminal Tribes Act, and that basically was a list of all the scheduled tribes in India that were inclined towards crime, or so the British administration thought. Based on this Criminal Tribes Act, they, would restrict freedoms of movement and trade and things like that to certain communities. So that's just one example, but even the census studies that were carried out in the 200 years or so of their rule, all of the categories were based on caste. So after like 200 years of this sort of ingrained idea that castes are different and things like that, you can understand that, a lot of differences were sown within the communities in India. So, and the thing is, a lot of them, because they were not given equal access to things like education, even during the British period, upper castes were given government jobs or services in the army and things like that. So these were denied to lower castes. Education was denied to lower castes. Um, English education was not given to people unless you were in an upper caste either. These are things that obviously had impacts. So now, historically backward castes like Dalits and even ethnic religious minorities like Muslims who faced all of this discrimination a long time ago, they're still sort of behind the other people who got all of these things back then. And these spillover effects have, they've sort of culminated in economic backwardness. So this is something that it impacts access to education even now in India. And I think
Okay.
these are some of the things that things like reservation in India, which is like affirmative action, they are still very like widely contested topics because reservation is guaranteed by the constitution And reservation was supposed to be a temporary measure, but it's still in place in things like civil jobs, in things like government institutions, public educational institutions, colleges, and things like that. And people, obviously, now it's been, I think, around 70 years since India's independence, and there is a lot of debate about what was supposed to be a temporary sort of provision, because now people feel like people take advantage of it even though they are from lower castes. There's a lot of discrepancies in the people from lower castes who actually need these sorts of affirmative action policies, and people from lower castes who have, sort of bridged that gap for themselves, so they don't really need reservation. And I think these are quite contemporary debates, not just in India but even in the UK or America, because affirmative action and, diversity policies and things, it's the same debate essentially. So yeah, there's quite a lot to be done in that regard.
That's really interesting though. So so is it possible now to move from one caste to another in India, to work yourself or educate yourself out of it? How does that work?
No, you can't do that because it's a defining feature of caste is the fact that it's descent based. So you can't change your own caste regardless of what you believe in or what your religious convictions are. It's just something you're born into.
Okay. Wow, that's very different from the Dutch system. That's interesting though. So, but actually, how that system works and the questions they have there also holds for questions like diversity. You mean like quotas or like that kind
Yeah,
of thing?
so reservation basically means quotas. So in a lot of public higher education institutes like Delhi University, they will have quotas for people from scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, other backward classes, and things like that. They will have reservations or quotas for people in government jobs as well, and any public office. Even in parliament, there's a reservation or quotas. So these are things that people are fighting against now, and there's obviously an argument on both sides. I mean, something that's sort of related to caste, which has come up again recently, is caste violence. Because
Is that
I think caste violence, again, it's similar to racism and crime that's, perpetrated because of racism, in that caste violence means discrimination or violence based on ground, like, caste. So there's obviously a hierarchy of caste. It's not like there's just segregations and that's it. There are upper castes and lower castes, so to speak. And historically, there's been a lot of violence against lower castes like Dalits, and there's been numerous incidents, and there was quite a recent one in September called the Hatress Murder, which involved like a gang rape and a murder of a lower caste Dalit girl by upper caste men. I'll spare the gruesome details, but I think this is also one of the reasons why I feel like the conversation about caste really needs to sort of come to light. It's been good the past few months because I think on a very global scale, people are now talking about race and issues related to race. But I feel like caste also forms a very similar parallel, and the struggles are very similar, but I feel like that conversation is not one that's being had yet. So I feel
so?
quite passionately about that.
So how could we go about? I don't know if discussing it or changing it. What is a way to go forward according to you?
I feel like definitely people in India need to be a little more aware about it, because caste seems to be a very unspoken thing back home. At least if you're from, have the privilege of being from an upper caste, it doesn't really come up in conversation unless someone explicitly brings it up for the purpose of discussion. So there's quite like implicit connotations of caste, in that there are still professions, like I was talking about spillover effects, there are still some professions like butchers and tanners that are associated with lower castes, and that has still perpetuated. So those are things you still see around you, like cleaners and stuff. So you will, at the back of your head, sort of implicitly assume lower caste, but these are not things that will be talked about at all. And I feel like they really should be.
But is it clear from? So you say that like the profession shows which caste somebody is from, but is it like when you meet somebody, can you see, or is there any way to
Oh
know?
no, definitely not. I don't think there's no like symbol or very visible thing, but obviously, because the entire idea of caste is premised on occupation, and it's been that way for a really long time, that also meant that you can't switch from one profession to another. So say you're from the lowest caste, and people like butchers sort of were, because in Hinduism at least, animals are considered to be quite sacred, so anyone who does kill them is considered, bad. Um, in that case, you can't really switch over from that because you're sort of discriminated against for being in that profession, and then all of your kids will continue being in that profession or similar professions. And obviously this is a very simplistic explanation of how it is, but some of that you can still see now. And because of the economic backwardness, a lot of um, the caste issues still perpetuate in places like small villages and stuff, which again have not that much access to resources, and because they don't have education and because no one is really talking about these issues or doing anything about them, they still perpetuate over there.
Okay, but this might be a stupid question, but do you eat meats in India, or is that like are
Oh
there
no, a
certain?
lot of people eat meat for sure. Um, they do, but historically in Hinduism, it's not. It's sort of frowned upon. The only people who used to eat a lot of meat in Hinduism is the royalty or the Kshatriyas, because they're the warrior class. So obviously for them it was sort of forgiven, so to speak. But Brahmins, which is the upper caste of the clergy, they completely, none of them did, because animals like cows are considered to be very holy, and it's seen as like a sin to hurt something else like a living being. So
Okay, and then
most Hindus are, I would say, vegetarian, but there is quite a lot of meat eaters, because although Hinduism is the majority religion, it's not the only religion in India.
does that go together, different religions in India, or are they like in different parts of India?
No, I would say it's definitely quite mixed up now. I mean, there are some states where you can tell what the majority religion is, states like Uttar Pradesh or north of India. But I would say it's quite mixed up, because there's been quite a lot of internal migration over the past few decades as well. There are obviously some areas like south of India which are predominantly Christian, and that has a history of missionaries coming in and setting up schools and things like that. So there's been quite a lot of that. North of India again has a history of another religion called Sikhism. I'm not sure if you've heard of that, but yeah, so north of India, especially places like Punjab and Haryana, which is where a lot of the holy sites for Sikhs are, that's probably the predominant religion. But otherwise, Hinduism is quite large. So
So what is that religion you just mentioned in the north?
Sikhism.
Yeah, so is how is it different from Hinduism or Christianity?
So Sikhism is sort of a reactionary religion to Hinduism, just like Jainism and Buddhism. I don't. So Hinduism in the early Vedic ages, it was quite a liberal and tolerant religion, or at least it meant to be. But later on in the late Vedic ages, it became quite ritualistic, very closed off, very exclusive, defined by just the clergy and the royalty dominating it. So they started to limit access to things like religious texts and stuff. They would say things like, oh, we are the only interpreters of the word of God, so everything we say is like gospel and you must listen to us, to put it very simply. And this is why a lot of people started becoming very frustrated by Hinduism in general. They thought it was less to do with faith and spirituality and more to do with sort of rituals and just idol worship and things like that. So a couple of reactionary religions came up. Buddhism was one of them, Jainism was one of them, and Sikhism also was one of them. So These obviously spread to different regions in India and even outside of India because we know places like Tibet follow Buddhism now. So Sikhism is, I mean, they follow I think the Guru Granth Sahib, which is their holy text, and a lot of the principles are similar, but it's a completely different like set of ideas.
Okay, so a little bit different, a different topic. You also did some. So in England, you did some some internships. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So over this past summer, I did one uh, internship, which was an equity research internship, which I mean was quite cut and dry, just equity research really. And the second one was at the Institute for Economic Affairs in London, and that's a very free market institution, which I thought would be interesting because I'm not the most free market person myself. So I thought I, just stir things up a bit. Um, but yeah, I think if your ideas and your beliefs can't really stand up to scrutiny, then you should probably reconsider them. So that's the reason why this was like a personal exercise for me to see what I really believed in and if my mind could be changed, which surprisingly it was on a lot of things. Um, and one of the biggest parts of the internship was this research project that I worked on, and that was analyzing how India's new national education policy, which was passed in 2020, how one of the provisions, the medium of instruction provision in schools, would impact children from lower income backgrounds. So I was basically looking at how there's this thing called the three language formula, which is followed in the national education policy since 1968, and how that sort of restricts access to English, which is something that data has said makes people better off in terms of income returns and employment. So I sort of make the case that by restricting it and perpetuating the three language formula, the lower income families which do not have any other access to the English language, apart from the public education that they get, are way worse off than upper class families which have access to education through other resources regardless of whether or not they're actually taught English formally in schools.
So the three language formula, what does that mean? Can you explain it a bit?
Yeah, sure. So the three language formula started in 1968's national education policy, and because there's a lot of languages in India, there's 22 official languages and just hundreds of other like spoken languages and dialects. It's quite difficult for the center to sort of perpetuate or enforce one specific language to be taught in all the different states. So they follow the three language formula, which is essentially like it says you learn in three different languages or learn three different languages. So say in a place like Bengal, which is where I'm from, you would be taught in English, you would be also taught maybe Hindi, and then you would be taught Bengali. In a place like Tamil Nadu in the south, you would be taught Tamil, you would be taught English. And this is controversial because South India has a history of sort of protesting against the imposition of Hindi as a language from the center, because Hindi, although I don't think it's very widely known, is only spoken in a certain region in India called the Hindi speaking belt, which is towards like the top and the central parts of India. So there's been quite a lot of historical, rivalry between the north of India and the south based on the imposition of Hindi as a language, and that's why places like Tamil Nadu and Andhra Pradesh and Kerala, they follow their own two language formula where they just learn English and their state language. So this is like it makes it quite clear there's a lot of political and cultural connotations to the use of language in India, and that's why the fact that English is something that is sort of like a neutral language in the Indian context, more so than all of the other regional languages. At least it's not completely neutral because obviously, like I said when we were talking about caste, upper caste during the British colonial period had a lot of access to English, and that sort of made them better off than a lot of other communities and castes. So because they already have this advantage, even now it's still seen as a social marker, the knowledge of English or fluency in English in India. So I wouldn't say it's completely politically neutral. but it doesn't have the same political connotations as a language like Hindi. So the three language formula this year uh, said that they would be learning in their mother tongue, and they would be learning another classical Indian language, something like Sanskrit or Pali, which are the equivalent of, say, Latin or Greek, and another foreign language. And English is classed as a foreign language in this case, which is quite surprising because most of our institutions, run on English, and it is one of the official languages. So I was analyzing how that would impact people from vulnerable communities quite badly. First of all, because it's very difficult to ascertain even someone's mother tongue in a state. Like I said, I'm from West Bengal. Like I live there, but my family is actually from Gujarat, which is the opposite end of the country to Bengal. And so my mother tongue is actually Gujarati, but in Bengal, everyone else's mother tongue would be Bengali. So even if the state adopts the system of teaching in the person's alleged mother tongue, I'm not actually learning in my mother tongue, which makes it difficult for me as a very young student to understand.
Wow.
So yeah, I know
That
that's a
makes it
lot.
complicated.
Things are very, very complicated.
But how does the government then work with all the different? uh, Do you have provinces in India? How does that work?
I mean, there is an educational committee. I think it's called the Narsimhan Committee. Yeah, I can't remember, so I'm gonna leave that one out instead of butchering it. But yeah, I mean, there's special like language teachers for every region, and because we have sort of like a quasi-federal system in that the center that does have powers to legislate, but the states individually also have powers, sort of like America, but not as there's not that much autonomy given to the states as in America. So. Um, Education is a topic which both the states and the center are allowed to legislate on in India. So, sort of, they do it sort of in conjunction with each other. The center will pass a bill on education, and then the states will modify the provisions based on their specific state educational systems and needs. Like each state even has its own system of examination.
Oh, that makes it complicated.
It is really complicated.
Okay, but then so a little bit back, you a little bit back on the previous topic, but you said that your internship was more free market than you were, and it changed your perspective in some ways. How did it
Mhm.
change your perspective?
Maybe on things like healthcare and even education to some extent.
Oh,
Things are
suggest.
yeah. Also on immigration, but we can come back to that later. um, so I'm quite a proponent in the state providing some basic things like healthcare and education, at least to a certain extent. Um, to an extent where people who can't afford private education actually have competitive quality education that's given to them by the state. So not just free education, but free and good education. I think one of the biggest differences in India, because we have a mixed economy, right? We don't have completely private or completely public services like healthcare, like the NHS does over here in the UK. And I used to think the NHS is a really good thing because obviously, I've seen the sort of waiting lines and stuff like that back at home in state hospitals and the state of government hospitals. People don't really want to go there unless, they absolutely have to. And that's probably not the best because there's quite a few people who really can't afford private healthcare in India. So when I came here, the NHS was something that I was like, wow, that's fantastic. But as the years have gone by, like I've also started to see a lot of inefficiency in the way that the NHS is run, and that's something that is quite topical in I think UK politics because the NHS has this almost like godlike status in the country. It's like no one wants to touch it, so you're not allowed to disagree with it. So that's something I also sort of went into the internship thinking. But after looking at some other free market solutions or like mixed market solutions, or even incorporating an element of like privatization into the NHS, so these are some of the things which I started looking at a little more affectionately after the internship. Even in matters like education, I think um, after being in India for so long and seeing the differences between state education and private education, it's become quite apparent that the amount of control that the government has on things like curriculum is something that can be misused to a very large extent. And obviously, we've seen like the extreme effects of that in places like Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia, and even in China during the Cultural Revolution. But there's just like small bits that whenever a government is in charge of a curriculum of writing history, there obviously is some degree of influence and censorship to sort of mold public opinion in a way that you would want, right? And that's something that really can't be safeguarded when all of these institutions are completely in the hands of the government. So I think that's something that my outlook has also changed on during the internship, is introducing at least some level of privatization to sort of safeguard against these concerns.
That's a really interesting point of view because in the Netherlands as well, they're like, should we have the market inside education? We only have a few players making like economics textbooks for high school. But that's a good point. If the government would make it, they would also decide what kids learn or not. And if you have a private institution, it's separate from the government.
Yeah, exactly. So at least with private, the thing is, even with the government, obviously there's a degree of transparency and accountability that is required for any of these institutions to work, and it's the same for private institutions. But at the same time, I feel like the government has a lot more power and influence to sort of, you know, backtrack on anything, and there's not much that people can really do about it. Once you've elected a government for say 4 or 5 years, even if you disagree with things, it's a very long road to making that change. So why, put that much power in someone's hands in the first place? Unless there is, a very good degree of accountability, which I feel like in most cases there isn't. At least in like developing countries, to be honest, maybe in developed countries, yes, there is scope for it. But in developing countries, there's still so much political turmoil that I think the question of handing over something as important as curriculum and education completely to the government is not something that I would be comfortable with.
So then another thing you are working on or are assisting on is causes and consequences of electoral violence.
Yeah.
So what is that? What is electoral violence?
So, this is a government-funded project which is being run by one of my professors at the School of Government and International Affairs here. His name is Dr. Patrick Kuhn, and the project is basically about electoral violence in England and Wales between 1832 and 1914. So, in England in 1832, there was a bill called the Great Reform Act, which was passed, and that basically changed, some of the provisions which discounted parts of the electorate. So back then, obviously, who could vote is based on things like property and income and your profession and all those sorts of things. There wasn't like universal franchise like we know it now. And that kept changing as legislations were passed over time. So the Great Reform Act sort of, like it says, reformed a lot of the things about the electoral system back then. And the interesting part is, because England was, a colonial power back in those times, they had a really excellent system of like note keeping and bookkeeping. So the accounts and the sort of data we can get from them back then is almost like flawless, whether it's data about places like India or any of their colonies, or elections and things that happened in England itself. So, an interesting part about the data set that is analyzed is between 1832, when we start analyzing, to the end in 1914, the electoral violence sort of started like taking off, and then it peaked, which means there was quite a lot of violence between like the 60s and the 70s. And then it sort of tapered off again before the First World War. So, it's very interesting because because there's so much like accurate data and a lot of newspaper coverage and media coverage, a lot of journals written and things like that that we can analyze, we can look at the reasons why the violence started in the first place, what are the political and sociocultural causes of that violence, and what made it sort of peak, what are the things that triggered people into, acting more violent during the 60s and the 70s, and then what are the causes that made it sort of subside right before the First World War began. And I think by looking at all of these three things, we can maybe generalize a little bit, extrapolate a bit, and then apply to places even now where electoral violence is a problem to see what are the things that make people take in their electoral behavior.
So why does it start? How far are you with the research? Do you have any ideas, even if they're not set in stone yet?
Well, yeah, I mean, they're definitely not set in stone because I think there's about another 2 years, if I'm not wrong, of the project that's still left, at least, to complete. And but at the same time, um, some of the main reasons during that time why people sort of behave the way they did was mostly because of things like taxation and differences in values, which I feel like is still the same fights we're fighting now. So I feel like by the end of the project, there will be, quite a few concrete answers that we can definitely map onto questions now. Um, a lot of it came from things like corn laws and malt taxes. Um, there was again a very large narrative of upper class people who, were like landowners who turned quite conservative because they were the ones who were benefiting from taxation and excise duties and things like that. And the lower classes, surprisingly, were the ones who rallied for things like free trade, because free trade, even in this account, is something that brought down essentially the prices of the commodities like wheat and flour and bread that are just everyday things that people need to live. And that's why lower classes were really for free trade, whereas conservative parties, as we know it back then, even they were quite against it. So that's something which I feel like is also still the case now. And that's why I feel like, a lot of the answers that will come out of this project, by the end of it, we will be able to use it.
Yeah, but then why does it go away? What is then the other side of that, that it peaks and then it slows down again?
This is also interesting because at least, so I was looking at West Kent as a constituency specifically. And what sort of started happening towards the end is that people stopped looking that much at policy issues, or policy in that sense, at least in terms of taxation and that sort of thing. And they started looking more at nationalist narratives. So, again, very similar to something that's happening now, I think, because towards the end, there were quite like the politicians that sort of came into power and the issues that started shaping people's voting behavior was more about what was happening outside than inside England. So things like the opium wars that were happening with China, and like just like other foreign policy issues, that these were the things that were sort of shaping how voters reacted to their specific parties, instead of things like taxation and what was actually happening inside the country. So I think that's also again something that can be mapped onto now, because people, I feel like they don't pay enough attention to the policy that actually affects them in day-to-day life. They look at more the sort of personality of the people that are leaders and how they behave on the world stage, rather than the very like nitty-gritty things that are happening domestically.
Yeah, I mean, yes, I agree. In the Netherlands, we're also seeing it's just like the very big things and the politicians, you know, like the head of the organization. Okay, but did you read the policies the other ones made? Like, did you think about this? So,
Yeah, exactly.
we're having the same problem. So then another thing that the main reason we even got connected is the Society for Economic Pluralism. So,
Yeah.
what have you been up to with the society?
Well, surprisingly, there's still a lot going on this term, even though we can't meet to do anything. So we've tried to, sort of turn everything online like everyone has. And we have a couple of main projects. The first one is called Pluralist Sessions. So we do like a speaker series every term. We try to bring in people from different backgrounds, academics, professionals, policymakers, all sorts really. And we look at some of the topical issues in economics, and these are more like formal talks, although we do have like collaborative Q&A sessions and discussion sessions at the end of every session. We actually have one of these tomorrow, so if anyone's interested, like I think we're having Dr. Sarah Stevano from SOAS tomorrow talking about Marxist feminism and COVID-19 and what essential work actually means. So that's going to be really interesting. I'm looking forward to that. We also have three more talks, I think, scheduled for the next 3 weeks consecutively, and those will be really interesting. Next week we have Mr. Alan Sked, who is one of the founders of UKIP, or the Brexit Party, and he's going to be talking about the economics of Brexit, which again I think should be really interesting. We have people talking about the political economy of displacement with reference to Somalia, so that should be interesting. And I think we're closing the term off with talking about China beyond the neoliberal consensus. So all of these I think are quite like varied topics, and it'll be really interesting to get all of these, like different perspectives on issues that we sort of talk about on a day-to-day basis but don't really think about deeply, at least economically or politically. Another thing we've got going is the curriculum review. We're planning to write a new one. So DSEP, we published a curriculum review, I think, in 2017, and that, like the name suggests, sought to sort of look at whether the economics curriculum in Durham was, providing the sorts of skills that we believed economics should have. And we're trying to do another version of that this year. So we're in the process of conducting a student survey to look at some of the skills that undergraduates and graduates like want from their economics degree. What are the main reasons why people choose to study economics as a discipline? What do they think economics should be for? Amongst a lot of other sorts of questions, whether or not they think that they're actually gaining these skills from the courses that they study in Durham, and what we can actually do to improve them. So that's something that I obviously am really passionate about, because I feel like in education the main way to progress is to sit back and take stock and have like some evaluative measures every couple of months or even years in time, to sort of understand how we're getting from point A to B to C, and looking back and seeing what we can change. I feel like unless we get an understanding of how things are working, how well or badly they are working, there's no way we can really move on from that. So that's a project which I am really passionate about, and I think rethinking economics in general is quite big on that. I really appreciate that. So that's one. Another thing we've done is digitized our academic journal, which is called The Pluralist. So everyone can check that out on the pluralist.uk. We've got 2 issues that are already up. They have quite a lot of topics that they touch upon. And we also conduct interviews with academics, which we sort of transcribe for the journal. Um, we're also coming up with a podcast series called the Pluralist Podcast. So we would definitely love to do a collaboration in the future. So yeah, these are just some of the things that we've been doing. There's a lot more that's in stock, but I feel like that's quite a lot.
That's really cool. So the Pluralist, you have different stories every week or month, or what kind of things do you publish in it?
So we've got 2 separate types of things that we do in the Pluralist. One of them is just our regular actual magazine issues. I think we do 2 issues a term. The next one is going to be coming out quite soon. And those are just longer, like topical, more editorial style articles about any issue, really. We don't really have like limitations on the kind of content that we would like to publish. It just has to be, well reasoned and interesting. So that's one. Another thing that we want to do is have like a feature section. So these are basically things like economic history, um, different schools of thought to touch upon what they mean, different economists that have sort of shaped the big ideas that we follow now, and give a sort of brief about all of these different things. We also have a section where we put up recordings of all the Pluralist Sessions or the talks that we host, and most of the talks are based on specific academic papers. So there's a database of all the papers that you can find if you can't attend the talk. So there's quite a lot going on the Pluralist, and if anyone's interested in writing, like, we would be very happy to have you just give it a shot.
We're just putting it out now, like everybody who wants, send them a message to pluralist.uk. Okay.
Thank you so much.
So with every person, we do a little lightning round. So I ask you a question, and the first thing that pops in the mind, you can just say it. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. What is a skill any economist should learn?
I think real world application. Theories are fun, but it's a waste of time unless it actually applies.
Who do you admire or look up to in economics?
I would say Amartya Sen, who is, I think, the Nobel laureate in economics in 1998, I want to say. His capabilities approach is something that's really shaped, again, the way I think. And he also was inspired by John Rawls, so it's a bit of the same line of thinking.
What is a question you want me to ask that I haven't asked you yet?
Hmm. Maybe how we can be better economists or just students in general.
How can we be better economists?
Um, I think the the most the most sort of like the best way to sort of conduct economics is actually to do instead of just sit and learn passively. And I feel like something that's missing in every type of conversation, whether it's political or personal or economic, is just confidence and open-mindedness. So I think those are the two key things. I don't think you should be afraid to talk about something if you feel like you have a good opinion or know something about it that others will want to hear. And I also don't think that you should, you know, not validate people who want to talk about something. You should at least have some sort of empathy and compassion for people's perspectives, regardless of how different they are from yours. And I don't necessarily think that in listening to someone, you do a disservice to your own values, if you know what I mean.
Yes, and I highly agree too. So, where can people find you or the things that you're most enthusiastic about if they want to learn more?
Probably LinkedIn to find out what I'm doing. Things I'm most enthusiastic about, maybe my Instagram, or just the Pluralist, to be honest. Most of my time is spent on that website.
So, and then finally, what does the future of economics look like according to you?
Um, I mean, economics is definitely here to stay. I just think that there is a lot of potential, and increasingly over the past few years, it's becoming more popular with the general population in terms of, how many people want to study economics. I just think that, again, there's a lot of room for improvement in the ways that we think about economics and learn it. So I think rethinking economics in general is a movement that I'm quite invested in. And I think if more people were, then I don't think the state of economics as it was in like 2008 would be how it is still. So yeah.
Well, those are some amazing insights. Thank you so much for making the time and for sharing your opinions and ideas. This is great. So,
Thank
thank
you
you.
for having me. This has been so fantastic.